What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I'm a lawyer originally, trained in Chinese foreign policy after that, and I currently work in China in an executive role, which requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China. I originally started putting these videos together for my mates back home to give them a basic framework to follow what the hell was going on the ground over here. I write and research everything myself, and everything I say on here I stand behind, and I would be happy providing to any paying client whose business requires that they follow China without the punditry and the BS, just the cold hard facts, sober analysis, and useful information for their business and their business intelligence going forward. So if that's something that you might be interested in, maybe consider subscribing. For everybody else, it's good to see you. I hope you're doing well wherever you are. If you're in the northern hemisphere, hopefully it's starting to cool down a little bit. It's cooling down here. It's quite lovely. This episode, we're going to have a couple of big deep dives. I've decided not to do many updates up the front. But at any rate, before we jump in, as always, if you enjoy the video, it's a massive help if you smash that like button. YouTube does not like content that is uploaded on a VPN, but I'm in China, that's all I can do. YouTube throttles the content, so a like, comment really helps with that algorithm. And of course, I've set up a Patreon now to try and ensure that this episode is 100% fan supported. Several of you guys have already signed up. It's an incredible support. Thank you so much. I've decided that for the first 20 people that sign up, I'm going to have a graphic in every show that has original supporters. So if you're in that first 20, your name will appear in every one of the shows going forward as an original supporter. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into this week's China Update. Okay guys, let's start with Taiwan, which of course is probably the reddest of the reddest lines for the People's Republic within the context of the China-US relationship, and frankly its relationship with every other country that it has formal diplomatic ties with. What has happened vis-a-vis Taiwan this week? Let's have a look. On Monday, US Assistant Secretary of State made the following statement about the US position on Taiwan. Quote, "The US has long had a one China policy. This is distinct from Beijing's one China principle, under which the Chinese Communist Party asserts sovereignty over Taiwan. The US takes no position on sovereignty over Taiwan," and went on to say, "We have changed nothing about these long-standing policies. What we are doing, though, is making some important updates to our engagement with Taiwan to better reflect these policies and respond to changing circumstances. The adjustments are significant, but still within the boundaries of our one China policy," end quote. So this statement, combined with other official exchanges with Taiwan, and within the broader context of historically poor US relations with the mainland and an increasingly territorially assertive mainland, suggests that we may well be seeing a major shift in US posture in East Asia, which involves much greater official engagement with Taiwan. This sort of shift would be a big deal, as it would be very difficult to walk back for the US and for the current administration and future administrations, and would be a central agitating element in the US-China relationship going forward, as Taiwan, like I said, is the reddest of red lines for the PRC, often described as, quote, "the most sensitive issue in the US-China relationship," end quote. In the same statement, Assistant Secretary David Stilwell also quoted a memo written by US President Reagan in August of 1982, which the US declassified last year. Quote, "The US willingness to reduce its arms sales to Taiwan is conditioned absolutely upon the continued commitment of China to the peaceful solution of the Taiwan PRC differences. In addition, it is essential that the quality and quantity of the arms provided Taiwan be conditioned entirely on the threat posed by the PRC," end quote. Now, this is an interesting statement, or an interesting quote that's been made within the context of the statement. I think the US here is anticipating that the Chinese side is going to accuse the US side of changing its policy. The US is anticipating this rhetorically, at least, is basically stating we're not changing our policy, we are changing our posture in a way that's consistent with our policy, which has always been for the maintenance of cross-strait peace, because of changes in mainland behavior. So this is, I think, what they are signaling here from the State Department to the Chinese side and to those listening around the world, in anticipation to the Chinese response. We're going to be discussing the Chinese response shortly, but a bit more on the US comments. Also, in an interesting move on Monday too, the United States also declassified diplomatic cables from 1982, which detail the so-called 6 assurances made to Taiwan after formally ending US recognition of the Republic of China, which was capitaled in Taipei, for the People's Republic of China, of course, capitaled in Beijing in 1979. By declassifying the cables, the US may be beginning to move away from its long-term policy of what is often called strategic ambiguity. That's the official name for this strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan. That is basically keeping how far the US would go to protect Taiwan ambiguous so as to best achieve a deterrence effect, whether that deterrence effect is against ideas of invasion from the mainland or to deter authorities in Taiwan from doing something like declare independence. We need to remember that the US policy towards the Taiwan Strait question has been a balancing trick between signaling to Beijing, hey, if you attack Taiwan, we will defend the island, while simultaneously also signaling to Taipei, don't do anything crazy, don't rock the boat, like declare independence, for example, because we may not defend you. So this is a very difficult balancing trick that the US has tried to pull off through this strategic ambiguity policy that it has had for decades. However, like I said, these new signals may be evidence that this decades-long policy from the US is about to change. Strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis Taiwan is under the spotlight. On Wednesday, the president of the Council of Foreign Affairs published a piece arguing, quote, "The policy known as strategic ambiguity has, however, run its course. Ambiguity is unlikely to deter an increasingly assertive China with growing military capabilities. The time has come for the United States to introduce a policy of strategic clarity, one that makes explicit that the United States would respond to any Chinese use of force against Taiwan. Washington can make this change in a manner that is consistent with its one China policy and that minimizes the risk to US-China relations," end quote. The US and Taiwan have also established a new bilateral economic dialogue to, quote, "explore the full spectrum of our economic relationship, semiconductors, healthcare, energy, and beyond, with technology at the core," end quote. Leader Tsai Ing-wen has made achieving a US-Taiwan free trade agreement a priority for this term in office. Though likely wary of agitating the mainland and upsetting the status quo, regular Taiwanese are most likely pleased at the idea of having closer economic and political ties with the United States. Both seem to be very popular among the general population, according to most scientific polling of the island. We can actually look at polling done by Pew, for example, in late 2019 to get an idea of how overwhelmingly popular this sort of move would be. Now, I'll put a few of these up. So we can see here in the first table we have here from Pew, we can see that the percentage in Taiwan who have a favorable view towards the US is just under 70% versus 35% for mainland China. Then we can see supporting close economic ties, 50% for China, 85% for the US. Supporting closer political ties, there's a slight reduction in favor of the US at just under 80% and a decent drop with mainland China there at about 36%. If we look at the second graph, we have more details of this breakdown, and you can see that across the board, closer economic relations with the US and closer political relations with the US both seem to be quite popular within the public in Taiwan. And we can see there is a bit of an age difference. Those who are above 50 years old seem to be the most lukewarm about the idea, although they still overwhelmingly support them. And then the younger generations are at about 90% for closer economic relations, and political relations there are about 80%, just over 80%. So we can see that the younger generations are slightly more in favor on balance. While we're talking about Taiwanese local politics, we should also touch on this week Taiwan's main opposition party, the Kuomintang, announced this week that the One China 1992 consensus will remain part of its cross-strait policy agenda going forward to the next election. So now let's look at the immediate government, state-run media, and academic response from the mainland. On Tuesday, Foreign Ministry senior spokesperson Hua Chunying, using fairly boilerplate language, responded, quote, "The so-called Taiwan Relations Act unilaterally enacted by the United States and the so-called Six Assurances to Taiwan constitute gross interference in China's internal affairs. They severely violate the One China principle and the 3 China-US joint communiques, as well as basic norms governing international relations." End quote. The same day, the People's Republic of China State Council of Taiwan Affairs made a special statement calling the Six Assurances 非法 or illegal and 无效 or invalid. On Monday, the state-run Global Times wrote on a US Navy reconnaissance aircraft, which the paper says, quote, was suspected of taking off from Taiwan Island, end quote, something the Taiwan military denies. The Global Times piece went on to say that if this was the case, it would represent the US, quote, crossing a red line, end quote, and would be, quote, justification for war, end quote. Similar points were discussed in a separate article by the Global Times entitled, quote, US intends to force China to fire the first shot over Taiwan, end quote. The language is interesting, as a few weeks ago, several state-run articles said that China would always defend its interests, but would never, quote, fire the first shot, end quote. On Tuesday, in a widely circulated interview, Jin Canrong, Associate Dean of the Renmin University of China School of International Studies, which is a top university in the mainland, provided his analysis on these latest developments with regards to Taiwan, saying, quote, "Now, we are not sure if the US would dare to establish formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan or not, and what China can do is to prepare for the worst-case scenario and speed up its military preparation. Once the US breaks the bottom line, the mainland must solve the problem by force once and for all," end quote. On Wednesday, Liu Weidong, a research fellow at the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, CAS for short, in Beijing, wrote a piece entitled, quote, "Pentagon won't sacrifice soldiers for non-core interests," end quote, in which he argues that, quote, "Washington has not publicly overthrown the One China principle because it does not wish to confront China militarily," end quote. Okay, so like I was in the middle of filming this and I ordered some dumplings and they just arrived. So I just stopped to have some dumplings and they're fucking good. So let's continue with the video. Sorry guys. Okay, so last week when we did this episode last week, we were talking about Wang and his winning hearts and minds tour of the EU. So how did China's Minister of Foreign Affairs do while he was visiting some of these major countries in the EU? Well, let's have a look. On Sunday in Paris, in a speech at the French Institute for International Relations entitled "Unity and Cooperation, Openness and Inclusiveness, and Joint Maintenance of the Progressive Trend of Peace and the Development of Mankind," end quote, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told an audience that, quote, "We never talk about China first," end quote, and that China and the EU should jointly confront, quote, "extreme forces," end quote, in the United States. He argued that the US was, quote, "publicly coercing other countries to take sides and attempting to push Sino-US relations into conflicts and confrontations." At the same event, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi was asked about Xinjiang and Hong Kong. On the former matter, Wang Yi stated that Uyghur Muslims had only been sent to vocational training centers, facilities which they had already been released from, and on the latter, Wang Yi said simply, quote, "We certainly cannot sit idly by and let the chaos go on. So we enacted a law maintaining national security that specifically suited Hong Kong's situation," end quote. On the EU-China Investment Treaty, Wang said, quote, "I am thinking of the investment agreement. We have the possibility of concluding it before the end of the year. It is important more than ever to take the step," end quote. Wang also called on the EU to negotiate a free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China. Though the trip was likely intended to win hearts and minds, Wang Yi made several rather stern statements that were reported by local media in Europe. When asked by reporters on the notion of a Nobel Peace Prize going to Hong Kong protesters, Wang said, quote, "China will firmly reject any attempt by anyone to use the Nobel Peace Prize to interfere in China's internal affairs," end quote. On this subject, Wang also said that the Czech Republic Senate Speaker would, quote, "pay a heavy price," end quote, in response to his visit to Taiwan for, quote, "interference in China's internal affairs," end quote. This provoked a response from the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who on Tuesday pushed back saying, quote, "In the European Union, we deal with our international partners together and with respect, and threats do not fit into that approach," end quote. Mr. Maas also called for parliamentary elections to take place in Hong Kong, and if not, then the EU should introduce a, quote, "common set of sanctions," end quote, in response. The German foreign minister also expressed concern with the situation in Xinjiang, saying, quote, "We would very much welcome it if China granted an independent UN observer mission access to the camps," end quote. Responding to Mr. Maas's comments, Wang Yi maintained that these are all China's internal affairs. The following day, the People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry maintained Wang Yi's position vis-a-vis the Czech visit, with spokesperson Zhao Lijian stating, quote, "We urge the relevant authorities of the Czech Republic to immediately take measures to eliminate the negative impact of this erroneous practice so as to avoid damaging the big picture of bilateral relations. We also inform the Taiwan authorities and the anti-China forces behind Vystrčil, your acts cannot alter the fact that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and your attempts of political manipulation and Taiwan independence separatist activities will not succeed," end quote. Over the weekend too, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell wrote 2 opinion pieces in French and Spanish in which he described China as, quote, "expansionist," end quote, and authoritarian, and, quote unquote, "a new empire," saying, quote, "Our relationship is extremely asymmetric for the current level of Chinese development, and that must be corrected. If we don't do it now, in a few years it will be too late. Chinese products will continue to move up the value chain and our economic and technological dependence will increase," end quote. This week's state-run media Xinhua announced that in the upcoming 17th edition of 求是, or Seeking Truth Journal, General Secretary Xi Jinping would be penning an article discussing the importance of teaching correct political and ideological education to children. In a preview, Xi Jinping writes, quote, "Courses in political education should guide students to strengthen their confidence in the path, theory, systems, and culture of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and inspire their patriotism," end quote. But it's not just students that he's writing about. On teachers, Xinhua writes, quote, "Teachers must have strong political convictions, love the country and the people, be good thinkers, broaden their vision of knowledge, exercise strict self-discipline, and have an upright character," end quote. Xi Jinping also demands that teachers, quote, "guide students to see and analyze correctly, dialectically, and rationally China's social problems," end quote, and reject, quote, "wrong ideas and trends," end quote. It seems she likely believes that creating the right ideology requires the right cultural environment, and that starts in the classroom. In late 2019, the party published, quote, "Outline of Patriotism Education in the New Era," end quote, in which teachers are described as, quote, "engineers of the soul," end quote. Though modern China has always had political education, the zeal in which it has been taught and studied has been decreasing, relatively speaking, since the 1990s. Many observers, however, have argued that under Xi Jinping's administration, correct ideology and political education are increasingly retaking a central position for the first time in a generation. Now, while we are on this theme of education, there is something that I wanted to touch on. Some of you guys, particularly those of you who do like to follow China, may have been hearing about some of these protests, some of these school sit-ins, these boycotts from Inner Mongolia. So basically, there have been reports of school boycotts in Inner Mongolia in the People's Republic of China by some ethnically Mongolian citizens in response to new education policies requiring that bilingual education offered in Inner Mongolia move from Mongolian medium curriculum complemented by Mandarin language and literature courses to Mandarin medium curriculum complemented with Mongolian language and literature courses. Put simply, they're going from being taught mostly in Mongolian to being taught mostly in Mandarin. While this is an interesting story to follow, I'm not sure whether this is going to be a big deal yet, but I am going to keep my eye on it, and if I think this could become a big deal on a national level, then we can discuss it in next week's episode. I've been to Inner Mongolia twice. It's a beautiful region, lovely food, great people. In the context of increasingly global scrutiny on PRC race relations issues, this could become yet another diplomatic/PR problem for Beijing to juggle, but domestically I don't think this is really going to go anywhere. We all know what happens with these protest movements. We know how the story ends. Like I said, if I do think this is going to morph into a bigger national story, we can discuss it in detail and give some analysis on next week's episode. Right, moving on. In the United States, the Department of State, in order to, quote, advance reciprocity, end quote, will now require senior PRC diplomats in the United States to receive approval to visit US university campuses and to meet with local government officials, as is the case for US diplomats operating in the People's Republic of China. The State Department also now requires, quote, cultural events with an audience larger than 50 people hosted by the PRC embassy and consular posts outside of mission properties will also require Department of State approval. The Department of State will also take action to help ensure that all official PRC embassy and consular social media accounts are properly identified PRC government accounts, since the US Embassy is denied unfettered access to PRC social media and PRC citizens are blocked from using Twitter and Facebook, amongst other social media platforms, end quote. PRC Foreign Minister Senior Spokesperson Hua Chunying responded the following day, telling reporters that the US move, quote, shows that the anti-China forces in the United States have lost their sensibility and confidence and developed anti-China paranoia, which will definitely be met with denunciation and opposition from people with insight, end quote. Okay, now I've put this near the end of the episode, but it is really one of the most important stories of the week after perhaps the Taiwan posture shift from the US. And that is, of course, the situation on the Sino-Indian border. Now, I have to say these developments are ongoing and the reports are not fully trustworthy at this point. I'm seeing some guys on YouTube making full-blown conclusions based solely on Indian Army statements or People's Liberation Army statements, which I don't think is advisable. But with all that in mind, let's look at the latest escalation on the Sino-Indian border. On Monday, Indian officials told reporters that Indian and Chinese troops once again engaged in a confrontation near the Sino-Indian border. The Indian side says that Chinese troops, and this was later reported to be approximately 500 Chinese troops, landed on Indian territory, the southern side of Pangong Lake in the Ladakh region, which is indeed typically recognized as being under Indian control. This confrontation appears to be less violent than the previous ones we've seen this year, particularly the major one that we saw in June, with reports suggesting that both sides just, quote, shouted and pushed, end quote. Although there have been stories going around of multiple deaths inflicted, neither side initially confirmed anything like that. However, on Wednesday, it was confirmed that an ethnically Tibetan Indian soldier had died from a landmine explosion. China has not released many details about the incident, but maintains that the Indian side was at fault and committed a quote-unquote blatant provocation, according to a spokesperson from the Western Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army, and that the Chinese troops, quote, never crossed the line, end quote, referring here to the line of actual control, the de facto border line for the two sides, according to a spokesperson from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the PRC. Speaking from France still, Foreign Minister Wang, much more diplomatically, told reporters, quote, the border between China and India has not been demarcated, so there will always be problems of this kind. We are willing to manage various problems through dialogue with the Indian side, end quote, after the confrontation, another incident occurred with Indian police sources saying a, quote, retaliatory special operations battalion, end quote, captured an, quote, important Chinese military post, end quote. There are also reports that there were several other attempts by the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese side, to, quote, transgress into the Indian side, end quote, but these are mostly unconfirmed at this point. On Wednesday, the Indian Ministry of Electronics and IT issued orders to ban 118 more Chinese apps after banning 59 apps after the bloody border clash back in June, a development that some in the Chinese media called a, quote, calculated provocative move by Prime Minister Modi's government to hide its domestic failures, end quote. Several of the Chinese apps that were banned in this round of sanctions boasted tens of millions of Indian-based users. Now let's take a step back for a moment. The details of these specific clashes themselves are not very important. Wider political and geopolitical considerations are more important. This all looks like the shaky attempts of both central governments to reduce tensions, and thus the likelihood of mistake, escalation, and war are breaking down, and we may well see another series of bloody border clashes between the world's two most popular nations. Whenever we have these fatal and violent border clashes, like we saw a few months back, the likelihood of escalation is much higher, even if neither side wants it. The domestic political situation of both countries severely reduces maneuverability for the leadership, especially on the Indian side, where the government cannot control media narratives as much. It is difficult to say exactly what happened. We are at the mercy of government and army statements on both sides. If the Chinese side did initially provoke this escalation, and it does seem to be on balance that this is the more likely of the two scenarios, it's very curious as to what their motives may be. In fact, for me at least, the timing is quite strange. While it would be very concerning if Beijing wished to push the border dispute with India after so recent and so bloody an incident a few months back, and in the middle of de-escalation attempts, what would be much more concerning, however, is if Beijing does not want to do this, but some People's Liberation Army troops on the ground are doing it anyway. And last up, let's end with an important report from the Pentagon. This week, the US Department of Defense released its annual report on China's military power. The annual report began publication in 2000, and this year conducted an examination over the last 20 years of Chinese military development. I've left the link to this report in the description below. Quote, the People's Liberation Army's objective is to become a world-class military by the end of 2049, a goal first announced by General Secretary Xi Jinping in 2017. Although the CCP has not defined what a world-class military means within the context of the PRC's national strategy, it is likely that Beijing will seek to develop a military by mid-century that is equal to, or in some cases superior to, the US military, or that of any other great power that the PRC views as a threat. As this year's report details, the PRC has marshaled the resources, technology, and political will over the past 2 decades to strengthen and mobilize the PLA in nearly every respect. Indeed, as this report shows, China is already ahead of the United States in certain areas such as 1. Shipbuilding, 2. Land-based conventional ballistic and cruise missiles, and 3. Integrated air defense systems. The report goes on to say, quote, more striking than the PLA's staggering amounts of new military hardware are the recent sweeping efforts taken by the CCP leaders that include completely restructuring the PLA into a force better suited for joint operations, improving the PLA's overall combat readiness, and encouraging the PLA to embrace new operational concepts and expanding the PRC's overseas military footprint. Despite the PLA's progress over the past 20 years, major gaps and shortcomings remain. The People's Republic of China's leadership are aware of these problems, and their strategy envisions a PLA undergoing almost 30 years of modernization and reform. Of course, the CCP does not intend for the PLA to be merely a showpiece of China's modernity, or to keep it focused solely on regional threats. End quote. In a press conference the following day, a spokesperson for the PRC Ministry of Defense, in response to the Pentagon Report, said it, quote, exaggerates the so-called Chinese military threat, distorts China's defense policy and military strategy, smears China's military modernization, development, defense expenditure, and nuclear policy, and provokes cross-strait confrontation and intensifies tensions across the Taiwan Straits, which are extremely wrong." End quote. The US Department of Defense believes that China doubled its military spending over the last decade, spending more than $200 billion in 2019. Okay guys, that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I am shattered. I'm so tired. I'm gonna edit this and upload it, and then I'm gonna go to bed and hopefully sleep 12 hours. It's been like an 80-hour week this week. Crazy busy, but I'm glad I could get this up for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Put your comments below. Let me know what you think. Like it, share it if you enjoyed it. And as always, stay safe and stay sane. And I will see you guys next time on China Update.